The pen scraped across the deed while my son whispered, "It's ours anyway." As the notary's flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead and the smell of wet wool clung to my coat, I'm Dorian Keats, 55, a retired foreman clutching the new house keys, smooth, cold, pristine. Ever had a moment where one small sound made you realize trouble was coming? It was the sort of cold that slipped under your coat and stayed there, the kind of day when even the steam from your breath felt heavy. The little notary office off Derby Street smelled faintly of wet wool. A dozen coats crammed into a rack by the door. The space heater hummed, barely doing its job, as a woman behind the counter pecked lazily at a keyboard, her nails clicking against the keys in rhythm with the buzz of the old fluorescent lights. I sat at a scarred oak table with my son Rowan across from me, the deed transfer papers spread out between us. My fingers were stiff from the walk over, but I managed to wrap them around the pen as Rowan leaned closer, his voice a murmur only I could hear. "It's ours anyway," he whispered as the pen tip scraped my signature across the page. The words weren't loud, but they stung more than the wind that had followed us in. I told myself I was here for peace of mind, for stability, for the comfort of knowing I'd be near Rowan and Sylvie as the years wore on. That's what I clung to, even as a glimpse of a Salem Works pension envelope poked from my briefcase by my feet, its bold red-type warning about year-end review. It was the kind of letter I should have opened, but I hadn't. Maybe I didn't want to admit how fragile security really was, even after decades of saving and working as an internal controller. I wanted to believe I was trading a little legal formality for a bigger prize, a seat at my family's table, when the nights grew long and the quiet too loud. Rowan sat straighter than usual, dressed in his charcoal jacket, his smile bright but practiced. He kept his tone warm as he tapped the signature line. "Dad, this is just to make things cleaner for taxes. If anything ever happens, you won't want the state sticking their fingers in what's ours." Sylvie beside him wore a cream coat that probably cost more than my first car, her nails tapping an impatient rhythm on the table's edge. She didn't look at me, only at the door, as though she had somewhere better to be. The clerk droned on about sections and initials, reading from a script without ever looking up. Rowan's hand hovered near mine as he guided my pen along the clauses, his thumb brushing my knuckles when my grip faltered. He had a way of making every gesture seem casual, even helpful. But there was a tension beneath it that I couldn't quite name. When the papers were done, Rowan slid the folder closed with a satisfied pat, leaning back as the clerk stamped the last page with a dull thud. He scooped the primary set of keys from the table before I could reach for them, holding them loosely, like they were already his. "Here, Dad," he said, almost as an afterthought, fishing a lone spare from his pocket and pressing it into my palm. Sylvie's lips curled at the corner, just enough for me to notice, as Rowan pocketed the heavier ring without breaking his smile. Her perfume lingered faintly, a floral note at odds with the musty wool scent that clung to the room. Neither of them seemed to notice the way I hesitated, the way I ran my thumb along the cold metal tooth of the key, feeling its edge against my glove. The clerk's voice faded into the background as we stood to leave the bell above the door, jingling against the howl of wind outside. A sudden gust threw the door wide as Rowan stepped through, scattering a few loose pages from the counter. One skittered across the floor, landing at my feet, a flyer for some local legal clinic I'd never heard of. I bent to pick it up, but Rowan's voice called from the street, urging me to hurry. He didn't turn back to see me tuck the page into my coat pocket, just kept moving through the swirl of snow, his shoulders squared against the cold. Outside, the air bit at my cheeks, and the sounds of the harbor carried faintly on the wind. Distant gulls a ship's horn, somewhere beyond the wharf. Rowan was already a few paces ahead, Sylvie clutching his arm as they stepped around a patch of ice, her heels clicking sharp against the pavement. I adjusted my scarf and followed the keys digging into my palm, through my glove heavier than any metal I'd ever held. They weren't much to look at. Shiny new without a scratch. But as I closed my fist around them, I felt the weight settle in my gut. A heaviness that didn't belong to the metal alone. There was a stillness in that moment, the cold cutting through every layer, the street lamp's glow bouncing off the drifting flakes. I told myself it was just the winter, just the ache of age in my bones. but some part of me already knew those keys carried more than entry to a house. They carried a warning I wasn't ready to read. As we reached the corner, Rowan glanced over his shoulder, his smile back in place as if nothing had happened. "Come on, Dad," he said lightly, his breath curling in the air. "We've got a lot to do before the new year." I nodded, falling into step, but kept my fingers wrapped tight around the key, the metal cold enough to numb my hand. It felt like holding onto something I didn't quite own, a reminder of a shift I couldn't yet name. The snowflakes clung to my coat as we walked silent and steady, while the notary's sign buzzed faintly behind us, fading into the distance. I didn't look back, not then. But as the wind cut across the street and the light dimmed, I knew the weight in my hand wasn't going to let me forget. The first dinner in the new house felt more like a formality than a celebration. The dining room was enormous, a cavern of polished oak and crystal light fixtures, and I found myself at one end of the gleaming table, a plate of reheated turkey and green beans in front of me. The others had retreated upstairs almost as soon as the food was plated, citing homework time for the kids. Though I could hear faint laughter and the sound of Malik's video games drifting down the grand staircase. The snow outside pressed against the tall windows, drifts reaching halfway up the sills, the glass trembling with each gust. The scent of roasted turkey still lingered in the air. But instead of feeling like home, it smelled like a memory that wasn't mine, something borrowed and fading. Each scrape of my fork echoed down the hall, as though the house itself was reminding me how empty it was, despite being full of people. Later, I wandered through the hall, passing framed photos of Rowan and Sylvie posing at charity galas, their smiles wide but never quite warm. Their voices filtered through a closed door at the end of the corridor. I paused, leaning slightly toward the sound without meaning to. "We can't keep floating these invoices," Rowan whispered, the frustration sharp despite his low tone. Sylvie's reply was little more than a hiss, followed by the distinct sound of paper tearing, deliberate sharp. I didn't need to see it to know she'd shredded another overdue bill. The grand house, the designer upgrades, the new vehicles out front, those weren't signs of success. They were shields held up against a tide I suspected was rising fast. I stepped back before the floorboards could betray me, the smell of Sylvie's perfume drifting faintly through the crack in the door. Floral and tense. In my room, I sifted through my own mail more out of habit than interest. My hands hesitated on a cream envelope from Salem Works, the pension administrators I'd worked with for years. The bold print on the front announced a mandatory year-end review, and I could almost hear Elizabeth's voice in the back of my mind urging me not to put it aside like I had before. The paper felt heavy, official, with a faint scent of toner still clinging to it. I slid it back into the envelope and set it aside on the nightstand, telling myself I'd read it tomorrow. But even as I did, a faint reflection in the glass cabinet across the hall caught my eye. Rowan hunched over my laptop, his shoulders tense, eyes scanning columns of numbers that I knew weren't his to read. The glow of the screen lit his face, all focus and calculation, no trace of the easy grin he wore for others. When I finally climbed into bed, the house was silent except for the distant hum of the heating system and the occasional crack of settling wood. I lay there staring at the shadows on the ceiling, realizing that this mansion wasn't the haven I had convinced myself it would be. It was a stage dressed up to broadcast Rowan and Sylvie's success, while I played the part of the silent investor who stayed out of sight. I told myself this move would make me part of something again, but instead it left me feeling like a spectator in a life I had financed, but didn't belong to. As I walked past their bedroom on my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, a torn scrap of paper drifted into the hallway, curling slightly in the draft. I bent to pick it up. The jagged edge bore a fragment of a number, a red stamp part of a bill Sylvie had ripped apart earlier. I set it on the console table by their door and kept moving, the faint creak of the stairs under my feet, the only sound in the vast, echoing house. The scrap sat there as I left, a quiet reminder that beneath the polished surface, something was already beginning to crack. The wind coming off the harbor rattled the neon sign outside Hal's Diner, making the flickering light stutter against the window like a bad heartbeat. Inside, the air smelled of pumpkin pie and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that clung to your coat for hours afterward. Lowell sat across from me, his gray stubble catching the light as he stirred his coffee with the sort of slow, deliberate motion that always meant trouble. The mug in his hand was chipped along the rim, and for a moment I stared at the flaw instead of the man. Then his words cut through the hum of the diner. "They're going to push you out, Dorian," he said flatly. Not as a warning, but as a simple fact like announcing the weather. I shifted in the booth, the vinyl squeaking beneath me. "It's not like that," I started, but my voice lacked conviction. Lowell didn't even raise an eyebrow. He just reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a cream-colored card, and slid it across the table. The embossed name, Beatrice Shaw, Attorney at Law, caught in the glow from the neon sign. Above her name, a faint gavel logo. "You'll want to talk to her," he said. "Before you don't have a choice." The weight of the card in my hand felt heavier than paper had any right to. I traced the raised lettering with my thumb, the edge of the gavel sharp against my fingertip. I hadn't come here for a fight, but Lowell had a way of making me realize the fight was already at my doorstep. He leaned back, letting the diner's dull chatter fill the space for a moment. "Saw your boy talking to a loan officer last week," he said. "Finally, bank downtown. Sounded urgent. Second mortgage, maybe." He didn't see me, but I saw the panic in his eyes. The words settled like a lead weight in my gut. The image of Rowan's confident grin from our last family dinner flickered in my mind, now replaced by the thought of him whispering over bank forms. "You've spent your life cleaning up other people's messes at Salem Works." Lowell went on. "Start cleaning up your own. Copy the emails, the audit files, anything that proves what's yours before they make it theirs." The wind rattled the diner's window again, the sound like fingernails tapping glass. I reached into my coat and slid my fingers over a small USB drive I'd bought that morning, its smooth plastic cool against my palm. It wasn't much, just a sliver of storage, but as I held it, I felt something shift inside me. The tremor in my hands wasn't from age, not tonight. It was from purpose, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. "You think it's come to that?" I asked, my voice lower now. Lowell's eyes sharp beneath his bushy brows didn't waver. "I think it's past that," he said. "You're not powerless, Dorian. You just forgot how to play the long game." We left together, the diner door creaking on its hinges as the harbor wind barreled in. The neon sign buzzed overhead, the light stuttering on my face as Lowell's hand settled on my shoulder, steadying me against the gust. Outside, the street smelled of salt and diesel from the fishing boats, and the cold bit at my ears. For a fleeting second, I remembered the first winter Elizabeth and I had spent in Salem, huddled together on the wharf, both of us laughing as the wind whipped our scarves around us. Now the only warmth was Lowell's brief squeeze on my shoulder before he turned toward his truck. Back at the mansion, the silence felt heavier than usual. The grand halls with their marble floors and echoing ceilings seemed to carry every whisper. As I passed Rowan's study, I paused, the faint sound of his voice slipping through the door. "We need to refinance before the bubble bursts," he muttered, his tone clipped urgent. The words hung in the air like a warning, the kind you want to ignore, but can't. I moved on quietly, the USB still warm in my coat pocket, every creak of the floor, reminding me just how thin the walls and the trust between us had become. The grand hall glowed with warm light, but I felt cold standing by the buffet, the scent of smoky barbecue drifting in through the open patio doors. String lights flickered above the crowd like nervous stars, their soft hum mixing with the low thrum of music from a portable speaker. Sylvie stood near the fireplace, champagne flute balanced delicately between two fingers, her laughter ringing brighter than the music itself. "Rowan and I worked so hard for this place," she said to a semicircle of guests, her tone practiced, almost theatrical. She didn't look my way, not once, as though I were part of the wallpaper, a decorative piece to be acknowledged, only if someone else asked. I spooned a few cold potato wedges onto my plate and nodded at a passing couple, though they barely noticed me. Near the French doors, two men murmured just loud enough for their words to travel over the clinking glasses. "Haven Estates lawsuits. Shady deals." "Someone's getting burned," one said, his hand cupped near his mouth. The words curled in the air like cigarette smoke, clinging even after they moved on. I tucked the phrase away, a quiet ember in the back of my mind, as I slipped my hand into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed the smooth edge of the USB drive and the stiff pension audit files. I'd been holding on to them for weeks, unsure if I was brave or foolish for keeping proof of things Rowan and Sylvie didn't even know I had. Tonight, the weight felt less like burden, more like ballast, keeping me steady, while they danced and sparkled under the glow of their carefully curated life. Lowell leaned against the far end of the bar, silent, his expression as still as the amber liquid in his glass. He caught my eye and gave the smallest of nods, as if to say, "I see it too." His presence was grounding, a reminder that I wasn't completely adrift in the sea of curated cheer. I drifted toward the patio for air, the drizzle tapping lightly on the awning overhead. The smell of charcoal and grilled ribs curled around me, an almost mocking reminder of the warmth I wasn't part of. The laughter from inside swelled and dipped a tide I'd stopped trying to ride. The party wound down near midnight, the music fading into low murmurs, and the occasional burst of laughter from the last guest lingering near the dessert table. Rowan clapped a hand on my shoulder as he passed the touch perfunctory, his eyes already tracking a departing guest. Sylvie approached next, her smile thin, her tone practiced. "Dad, for security reasons." "We think it's best if you give us your set of keys," she said softly, as though her gentle voice could soften the barbed edge of the request. "Only temporary, of course. We'll sort things out next week." Her hand extended, palm open, fingers poised like a poised pianist awaiting her cue. For a moment I considered refusing. The weight of the metal in my pocket was more than just steel and brass. It was the last tangible link between me and the house I had bought. But the quiet around us, the half-closed eyes of the staff clearing glasses, and the cool glint in Sylvie's gaze, told me this was not a conversation I'd win here. I reached into my pocket, the sound of the keys scraping against my wallet, loud in the otherwise hushed room. The metallic clink as they dropped into her palm echoed louder in my chest than in the hall, each ring snapping shut like invisible shackles. Sylvie's smile widened just enough to pass for gratitude before she turned away, slipping the keys into her sequined clutch. I retreated upstairs, the USB and files, now the only proof I still had a stake in this life, however small. The house seemed to grow colder with every step, the echoes in the stairwell, carrying my thoughts back to every concession I had made to keep the peace. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I ran a finger along the ridge of the USB drive, feeling its tiny grooves. The pension letters lay beside me, their creased edges catching the soft light from the bedside lamp. The thought settled firm and unyielding. The time for silence was ending. The floorboards creaked behind me as I stepped onto the back porch, the drizzle now a steady mist against the screen. Lowell was waiting, his collar turned up against the damp, his gaze steady. He didn't waste words, just leaned close enough for his whisper to carry over the sound of rain. "Tomorrow, Beatrice." Enough is enough. The words felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in months. I nodded once, gripping the porch railing, the cool metal slick beneath my fingers. The drizzle softened into a fine spray, the last string light flickering overhead, as if the house itself knew the balance was about to shift. The ceiling fan above Beatrice Shaw's desk let out a rhythmic squeak, with every rotation a slow, uneven pulse that filled the cramped office between her clipped sentences. The place smelled of stale coffee and paper, a scent that clung to the Boston Globe, folded on the corner of her desk. I sat opposite her, the edge of a heavy folder digging into my thighs, my fingers trembling just enough to rattle the clasp. "Haven Estates is under investigation," she said, sliding a series of photocopied deeds across the scarred wood between us. Her voice was measured, almost detached, as she tapped the highlighted sections with a neat red pen. "Your purchase was illegal. The company used encumbered properties, this house included, to pad their holdings before they declared bankruptcy." Her words landed with the weight of iron, each one cold and final. I shifted, gripping the folder harder, feeling the stiff edges bite into my palm. The room's air felt too still, heavy except for that squeak above us and the faint hum of traffic outside. Lowell sat to my left, arms folded across his chest, his expression carved from stone. When Beatrice paused to let the information sink in, his low voice broke the silence. "If you go forward, Dorian, you'll get your money back," he said, eyes fixed on mine. "But Rowan and Sylvie will lose everything. No house, no reprieve. They won't see it coming." His words weren't cruel, but they didn't carry softness either. Just the truth, as he always delivered it. Beatrice slid another document forward, an authorization for her to begin proceedings on my behalf. You've got two options, she said, her tone still precise. We can file to recover your funds immediately, but Haven Estates bankruptcy will make this a drawn-out fight. The assets are there. They'll just take time to free up. Or, she hesitated, letting her pen hover over the paper. You can stay quiet, keep them in the house for now, and risk losing everything. There's no middle ground here. I glanced at the neat rows of type, the embossed stamp in the corner, and the spot where my signature was supposed to go. My hands were trembling again, not from the weight of the decision, but from years of letting others hold the reins, while I convinced myself I was still steering. Outside the office window, a pale figure caught my eye. Rowan pacing the sidewalk with his phone clamped to his ear, his free hand slicing the air in frustration. His lips moved in sharp, jerky phrases I couldn't hear. But the look on his face was enough. Panic was setting in. He didn't know what Beatrice had just told me, didn't know that the ground beneath his carefully curated life had already begun to crumble. I watched him for a long moment, the pane of glass between us, like a quiet metaphor, his world on one side, mine on the other. Beatrice's pen clicked softly as she set it beside the papers. If you want to move forward, we file today, she said. The earlier we act, the stronger our claim. The law will be on your side. The folder felt heavier now, as if the legal paper within carried not just my savings, but years of swallowed pride and quiet humiliation. I set it on the desk and flattened my palm on the cover, feeling the texture of the rough cardboard, the subtle give beneath my hand. For a heartbeat, I thought of Elizabeth, how she used to tell me not to let guilt masquerade as loyalty. I thought of dinners alone, of whispers behind closed doors, of my own son, rifling through my bank statements when he thought I wasn't looking. When I finally picked up the pen, my hand didn't tremble. The tip scratched steadily across the paper, the ink soaking into the fibers, like a line drawn in sand. Beatrice nodded once, professional but not cold, and gathered the signed pages into a neat stack. They'll get their eviction notice in 2 weeks, she said, slipping the documents into her briefcase. Her voice was calm, almost gentle now. Prepare for the fallout, Dorian. It's coming. The squeak of the fan seemed louder as I stood. The smell of old coffee hanging heavier in the air. Outside, Rowan's voice rose sharply, though I still couldn't catch the words. I slid my hands into my coat pockets, feeling the folder's absence replaced by a strange, unexpected lightness. The sun hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, and for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. The knock came just as the saxophone from the neighbor's radio drifted into a softer register, a lazy tune threading through the thin walls of my apartment. The sound echoed down the narrow hall louder than it should have been, followed by a pause, and then Rowan's voice cracked unsteady, a far cry from the confident tone he used to reserve for everyone else. Dad, we need you, please. The rain outside tapped steadily against the window, streaking the glass in uneven lines, each droplet catching the dim glow of the street lamp beyond. I sat for a moment on the edge of the old sofa, my thumb grazing the cold metal of the mansion key I still kept in my pocket. It was the only piece of that life I had allowed myself to hold on to, not as a token of nostalgia, but as a reminder of what betrayal can feel like in your hand. When I opened the door, Rowan and Sylvie stood beneath the weak hallway light, rain plastering their coats to their bodies. Rowan's eyes were sunken, his jaw tight. Sylvie, usually so meticulous, had mascara streaking faintly at the corners of her eyes, her breath sharp and uneven. Behind them, the mist rolled in from the harbor, softening the street's edges into a haze. They didn't wait for me to speak. Rowan stepped forward, his voice catching again. The bank, the eviction notice. We're out in a week. I need a loan, just enough to hold them off while I work something out. You know people. You can talk to them. You can. Sylvie cut him off, her tone, thin and urgent, as if the single word could erase years of what they'd done. Family, she whispered, clutching her coat at the collar. We're family, Dorian, please. The word hung in the air like cigarette smoke, faintly sour, impossible to ignore. I felt a flicker of something, habit maybe, or memory. But then Elizabeth's voice, clear as it had been on the porch of our old house one autumn evening, rose in the back of my mind. Don't let guilt dress itself up as love, Dorian. Don't let them mistake your heart for a doormat. The faint scent of fresh paint from the apartment's recent touch-ups mixed with the damp air, grounding me in the present as that echo of her voice steadied me. I remember I said, slowly stepping back enough for the hallway light to cast my shadow across the wall the night you threw me out. How careful you were to make sure the guests didn't see me leave. How you looked at me like I was just something to be carried out with the trash. Rowan flinched just barely, but his jaw tightened. That was a mistake, he said quickly. We were under stress. This is different. We're not asking for much. Just help us get back on our feet. You can't let us lose everything. The rain picked up outside, rattling against the window panes, the jazz next door slipping into a low, aching trumpet. I shook my head. You whispered, "It's ours anyway," as I signed the papers, Rowan. I heard you. Do you remember that? His eyes darted away toward the floor, then back to me, a flash of anger rising as his desperation cracked into something sharper. So you're just going to let us drown? After everything you've done for us, you're really going to turn your back now? Sylvie's hand gripped his sleeve as if to anchor him, but she didn't speak again. My hand rested in my pocket. Fingers curling around the old key, the chill of the metal bleeding into my skin. Before Rowan could take another step forward, a firm knock sounded behind him. Lowell's voice followed, calm and steady. Evening. He stepped into the doorway, his hand finding my shoulder, a grounding weight that steadied the churn in my chest. Dorian's made his choice, he said evenly. Time for you two to make yours. Rowan's nostrils flared, his lips parting as if to argue, but Sylvie tugged his arm. Come on, she murmured, her voice nearly lost beneath the patter of rain and the muted trumpet through the wall. Rowan stared at me one last time, his expression a muddle of fury and something softer, fear maybe, before turning sharply down the hall. I stood at the window long after the sound of their footsteps faded into the mist outside. The rain streaked the glass in crooked lines, the street lamps glow, casting their retreating figures into wavering silhouettes, before the fog swallowed them whole. My reflection hovered faintly on the glass, the dim interior light outlining my shoulders, my face. The key in my pocket felt heavier than ever, but not as a burden, more as a boundary, a line I had finally drawn. As the last notes of jazz faded into the soft static between songs, I realized I wasn't sure what I felt. Relief, maybe. Mourning, perhaps. Or both tangled together like the rain and the mist outside, slipping silently into the night. ChatGPT said the key turned with a crisp click, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't drag a weight behind it. No dread, no phantom ache of a door I might one day be locked out of. Just the quiet satisfaction of a lock, turning for me, on a house that was wholly mine. The screen door gave its habitual squeak as I stepped into the modest entryway, the scent of lilacs drifting in from the yard, carried by the spring breeze. The hum of distant lawnmowers floated on the air, a reminder of life beyond the walls, steady and unremarkable, exactly what I needed. On the porch railing, I set down my old coffee cup, the one Sylvie had nearly tossed into the trash years ago. Its crack now neatly sealed with a strip of yellow tape. It looked a little absurd, but in its own way, it felt like a trophy. Broken, mended, functional. A reflection of me, maybe. Lowell sat on the steps, his chipped diner mug steaming faintly in his hand, a rare smile softening the lines of his weathered face. You can build a new family, Dorian, he said, his voice low but sure, as if the thought had been simmering for a while. One that chooses you, not one that just takes. I looked out at the quiet street as a couple of kids coasted by on bikes, their laughter skipping like stones down the pavement. A neighbor walking a retriever gave a wave. I raised my hand automatically, and the gesture didn't feel foreign. These were small things, nothing like the hollow spectacles Rowan and Sylvie used to stage, but they carried a warmth that I couldn't recall feeling in years. The compensation from the Haven Estates case had landed in my account months ago, not the full sum, but enough to buy this 2-story place on the edge of Salem, with room for a small garden and a porch where the morning sun reached me before noon. I'd carved out another part of it for the Salem Works retiree fund. A nod to the colleagues who'd walked the same long road I had, some less lucky in their outcomes. Twice a week, I volunteered at the community center, reading old storybooks to groups of kids whose parents worked double shifts or weren't around at all. They listened more than my own grandchildren ever had, their eyes wide, their questions endless. Each time I closed a book, there was a moment, just a beat, where I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe it was belonging, or maybe just purpose. By evening, the sky had shifted to a soft blue-gray, the kind that hinted at rain, but never delivered. Lowell and I sat on the porch, the mended cup beside me, a couple of glasses of whiskey, catching the fading light. The lilac scent deepened as the air cooled the faint buzz of cicadas, starting up in the shrubs. "Strange, isn't it?" I said, swirling the amber liquid. "I thought I'd feel smaller somehow, without them." Lowell leaned back, stretching his legs out, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You don't look smaller to me," he said. "You look lighter." I glanced down at my hand, the new house key, cool against my palm, its edges smooth and sure. With the cup on one side and the key on the other, I realized there was no void left to fill. I was whole, even without Rowan, even without the fragile version of family I'd clung to for too long. The next morning, I stopped by the local market to pick up a loaf of fresh bread and some early strawberries. The place buzzed with the chatter of neighbors, the faint hum of an old radio behind the counter. Near the citrus display, I spotted Rowan. He froze, his hand hovering over a stack of oranges. For a moment, our eyes met. I didn't feel anger or even the old sting of loss, just a calm, settled stillness. I gave him a small nod, the kind you give an acquaintance in passing. No accusation, no invitation, just acknowledgement. He blinked, then turned away without a word, disappearing down another aisle. I stood there for a moment longer, the scent of lilacs still clinging faintly to my jacket, before turning back to the register. Outside, the lawnmowers hummed, the air held the same easy stillness, and for the first time in years, the sound of the key in my pocket felt like belonging not to anyone else, but to myself. The air along Essex Street carried the crisp bite of October, laced with the scent of cider and faint wood smoke drifting from the cafes lining the historic cobblestones. Red and gold leaves skittered around my shoes as I strolled past the old storefronts, my mended coffee cup warming my hand. Just ahead, Rowan stepped out of a hardware shop, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no anger in his gaze, no plea, just a stillness, a quiet understanding that whatever bound us once had dissolved into something distant, and maybe that was fine. I gave him a simple nod, nothing more, and he returned it with the same restraint before continuing down the street. The encounter, so muted, felt like the final thread snapping without a sound. No bitterness, no welcome, just closure. From around the corner, a ripple of laughter broke the silence, children's voices spilling out from the community center, where bright banners flapped in the breeze. The sound tugged me forward, away from the empty weight of what used to be, toward the life I'd been building piece by piece. Inside, the hall buzzed with warmth, neighbors, volunteers, and a handful of the Salem Works retirees I'd once toiled beside, now smiling as a modest plaque was unveiled. The Elizabeth Keats Scholarship Fund. It read, the lettering etched in soft brass beneath a simple engraving of a rose. When they asked me to speak, I kept it short, my voice steady, despite the emotion tightening my throat. Elizabeth believed in second chances, I said. This fund is for those who need one, just as she would have wanted. The room filled with gentle applause, and as I stepped back, I caught Lowell leaning against the back wall, his chipped diner mug in hand, his chuckle mingling with the faint jazz drifting in from the cafe next door. Later that evening, as the sky dimmed to a dusky violet, I settled onto my porch. The porch light flickered softly, drawing faint halos in the cool air. My suitcase from a recent trip sat by the door, still dusted with traces of foreign soil, a reminder of the ruins of Rome. I'd wandered through the narrow streets of Paris, where I'd stopped to sip espresso, the quiet blue edges of the Greek islands, where the sea had lapped softly at my feet. They were journeys Elizabeth and I had once whispered about, but never taken, dreams deferred until I finally carried them out for the both of us. The low strains of a jazz record spun from the old player in the living room, blending with the faint chorus of cicadas just beyond the lilac bushes. I lifted the mended cup to my lips, the faint clink of ceramic soft against the night's hush, and whispered to the still air. Family is who shows up, not who shares your name. The words felt weightless, not bitter, not defiant, just true. There was no sting in saying it anymore, only a sense of calm that spread through me like the warmth of the drink in my hand. Beyond the porch, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm, distant chatter, the bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves skipping down the street. As the stars began to appear, a soft knock came at the door. On the step lay an envelope, its flaps stamped with the logo of the Community Foundation. Inside, a letter invited me to help expand Elizabeth's scholarship fund, turning it into something lasting, something bigger than I'd ever imagined when I first signed the check. I smiled as I traced the embossed lettering, feeling the quiet thrum of contentment in my chest. The night air was cool, but not biting. I leaned back in my chair, the lilac scent faint but still there, and let the jazz and wood smoke carry me into the knowledge that whatever chapters were left for me, they would belong to me alone, not to old wounds or old ties, but to the life I'd finally chosen. The autumn light had thinned to a soft gold, stretching long shadows across my porch as the lilac scent faded into the evening. I cradled the mended coffee cup, its yellow tape, now just a quiet reminder of how some breaks can be fixed, not forgotten. Life had taught me that justice doesn't always roar. It can whisper, nudging you toward new roots and honest connections. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone facing a loss, a betrayal, or a door closing, there's still a path forward, often in places you never thought to look. Has life ever surprised you with a second chance you didn't see coming?